Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Aaron Hurtis. I am a Science Communications Officer with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our webinar today is going to focus on a topic that is really of major interest to our members, which is how to effectively communicate your research to the media. We have two great speakers today. I'll introduce them in just a moment, and we'll have time for a lot of time for questions and answers after the presenters conduct their opening remarks. And before we start, we wanted to ask you all to answer two quick poll questions for us that touch on some major considerations we often hear from scientists and from our members about their interactions with the media. So let's pull those up now. All right, so you see this poll question here, why are you interested in talking with the media? And you can go ahead and click any of those buttons. You can click as many as you like. We'd just like to get a sense of what's drawing you to this topic and what you're really interested in when it comes to speaking with the media. Okay. You can see some of the results coming in there. Looks like a lot of you are interested in educating the public and influencing policy decisions and, of course, fighting scientific misinformation. This last option here, it's just fun. I'm glad to see at least a minority of folks clicking it's just fun, because I do find that a lot of scientists who do work with the media actually do get a lot of enjoyment out of it. There can be a little bit of frustration too. I also see the top result here, raising my profile, name recognition in my field. That's good to see. That's something we know that a lot of scientists are concerned about, especially when it comes to feeling like you can be self-promoting when you're talking with the press, but it's also something that can be really valuable for your career and for your research. All right, great. The next set of questions is about worries and concerns that scientists have expressed to us when it comes to their work with the media, and we would love to have you just quickly fill this out too. So what are your concerns about communicating with the media? Misrepresentations, not knowing where to begin, wondering if it's worth your time or if it's too time-consuming, feeling like other scientists in your field have it covered, that journalists don't respond to you, that coverage can oversimplify research, and another worry that we sometimes hear is that other scientists might criticize. All right, misrepresentations and misunderstandings. A lot of folks worry about that. No one has clicked not worth my time yet. I'm really happy to see that. Don't be afraid to click it if you feel that way, but that's very good. Not knowing where to begin, feeling like other scientists have it covered. That coverage can oversimplify research, very popular answer. I think that's something that we struggle with every day too. And happy to see minority folks saying that they're worried about other scientists being critical of what they have to talk about. Okay, great. So it's a really good baseline to start our conversation. Our first presenter today is Dave Robinson, and Dave is the director of the Global Snow Lab at Rutgers University. And additionally, he's also the New Jersey State climatologist. And I grew up in New Jersey. New Jersey is my home state. So it's been great to work with Dr. Robinson and to be able to work with my home state climatologist. And Dave has been incredibly helpful to us, especially in thinking through how we communicate about a topic that's often hard to communicate about, which is the link between climate change and winter weather and snow cover. And Dave's been very helpful in sharing his expertise there. He's also someone who answers hundreds of media inquiries, particularly through his position as a New Jersey State climatologist. So it's hard to think of other scientists who have the depth and richness of media experience that Dr. Robinson has every day. Our second speaker is Jeff Nesbitt. Jeff is the executive director of Climate Nexus, climate communications group that we've also been very happy to work with. We brought Jeff on to share another perspective, which I think is really interesting. Jeff has also served as a high-level public affairs official at the Food and Drug Administration and at the National Science Foundation. So he has worked with a lot of scientists who work on just a ton of different topics. And he's worked in particular for two science agencies that are really familiar to a lot of scientists that do a lot of very interesting work and a lot of work that has bearing on public policy. Additionally, Jeff will be talking about storytelling a little bit. He also happens to be a novelist, which is a really neat communication skill. So he'll be drawing some parallels there to think about in how we tell stories about our research. So thank you for listening to the intro, and with that, I would like to pass it off to Dave to start off his part of the presentation.
All right, that's terrific. Thank you, Aaron. As I set up my slides, there you can see a little bit of my introduction to scientists and musings regarding interactions with the media. As Aaron mentioned, I wear two hats at Rutgers University. I am a professor in the Department of Geography, but I've also, for the last 23 years and counting, served as the New Jersey State climatologist, an appointed position through the dean of our university via a gubernatorial decree decades ago. It's an apolitical office. And we're there, as are other state climatologists around the nation, as climate service providers, gathering data, old and new, turning it into information, working with stakeholders to develop knowledge, and ultimately to help make decisions. Our credo as state climatologists is along the lines of locals trusting locals. And with that, we can help them make informed decisions in concert with regional climate offices and with the National Climatic Data Center, for instance. So that's one hat. And my other hat is my research side of what I do, and that is working as director of the Rutgers Global Snow Lab. We keep tabs on the distribution of snow across northern hemisphere lands, the longest satellite data record of any environmental variable that's been relatively stable, and we've identified such things as early spring snowmelt over northern hemisphere lands in the last decade or two. And with both of them, I handle a lot of media inquiries. As Aaron said, I give upwards of 300 to 400 media interviews a year regarding state climate issues. Some very short-term, the latest storm, some longer-term, the cold winter, some getting into the dimensions of climate variability and change. My snow work gets more into the longer-term perspective. But my feeling is everyone gains when you interact with the media. You provide background information, you provide perspective as a scientist on relevant issues. It raises public awareness. The third bullet here, we're the public university. We're the State University of New Jersey. I get federal research funds in the past through NSF, recently NASA, NOAA, and some other entities, so there's a certain obligation there. And as a state climatologist, we're a land grant university, so that's part of our mission as service. So I do feel an obligation to do this. It's just part of teaching. I may have 280 students in my courses this semester, but I'm going to reach a lot more by talking to newspaper, radio, television, and other forms of media. So I really think it's important, and it is an obligation as a scientist to reach out and talk to many people in various different venues. As I said with this next slide, be proactive. My Boy Scout years, be prepared. You want to foster that culture. I don't put out press releases. I've worked with the University Media Relations in the past, but I'm on people's, if you will, Rolodexes. They come finding me these days because there's been a culture. If something's going on, for instance, in the state, get in touch with Robinson. He'll have something to talk about to help make it a more informed story that they're trying to tell. So I think it's really important. I can put perspective on weather events. I do not forecast the weather, but I can put historical perspective, put a certain spin on the event, put a climatologic context on it as well. We post material geared towards reporters. I don't have Twitter in particular, but we have a Facebook site that one of my assistants loads onto. We have a website where we do occasional updated reports. I do a monthly narrative on conditions. On the snow page, we post daily images of snow across northern hemisphere lands, and we're the only people, I guess, in the world who puts anomaly maps of snow cover extent up each day. So it's something people are going to get used to going and looking at to develop background information, and ultimately, if they're interested, contact me. We develop and maintain contact lists. As I said, mostly it's the reporters doing that. Media relations can be helpful, but I find at times they're overwhelmed with other things, and it's much better if I work directly with the media contacts. And don't be afraid to follow up if you're misquoted, a headline is inappropriate, there's attribution lacking. When you think you've given them a half an hour on the phone and your information appears in an article and you're not mentioned, fool me once, okay, but not twice. When you're talking, don't over-explain. But as I'll say in a second, don't under-explain either. For instance, if someone asks the difference between weather and climate, you might use these two quotes. But another way of telling the story is to talk about it in a vernacular that they might better understand and be able to communicate. But you kind of have to know which outlet you're talking to in terms of how to frame how you want to say something, how you want to tell that story. As I said, don't oversimplify. I literally have given hundreds of interviews related to Sandy. The week before, 100 within 2 weeks after, and so on and so forth. And this included the local fish wrapper up to the Discover Channel with interviews. And, what I try to do there is break things into component parts to let them know there's a lot of ingredients to this. Here are the key factors. I might even send them along a figure or two that I stumble across. And then I add to it again, and I'll put in a vernacular of adding insult to injury. This happened to make a bad situation even worse. So I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence. Again, it's knowing your audience, but also quickly getting to the point and making it in a bullet aspect if you're giving them a certain amount of data. Now, you'll know pretty quickly into a conversation with a reporter, frankly, if they're getting it or not. And then you have to use your judgment on how much to give them and how much to pull back. I'm consistently amazed how reporters, with these rapid interviews, I say here, can quickly go from another type of story to my story and then on to another one and take my babbling and put it into real sentences. Yet at other times I've spoken with reporters that have set science back to the pre-Galilean times. So you kind of have to know a feel for that. It's a pleasure sometimes when you're working on a feature article. I've had my work several times in the Science Times of the New York Times and with other journals, because then you can go back and forth with the reporter or the graphics department. This slide shows you something I quickly did when I did a television interview just a week ago with our last, well, to date at least, our last snowstorm of the season. And I showed them from the broad eastern U.S. view where the moisture was coming to give us our 5 to 10 inches of snow. On the top right, I zeroed in on the local radar to show them how it was varying around the state. And then in the middle shot was a temperature image. And there, frankly, I was promoting the New Jersey Weather and Climate Network that my office manages. We have almost 60 stations we poll every 5 minutes around the state. So I unapologetically made sure I threw something in that promoted something we were doing within the state. The next slide shows you how I worked recently with the Los Angeles Times. They were doing a story on snow cover, and I first provided them with data, and they came up with the graph on the left. I think you might agree with me that that graph on the left is lacking of any real great information and telling a good story. So with multiple back and forth, look what it turned into and actually made it into print and onto their website on the right, where we broke it into seasonal coverages, and we much more easily and identified the different years, the different seasons, and the trends in spring snow cover versus, say, winter. So that came from a lot of back and forth. It took time, and it was a little frustrating, but ultimately you can see how with time you can work with these folks. A few other thoughts before I finish up, and as I just said before, patience. You need patience sometimes. You need to work with the reporter. You have to know when you cut it off if you think that they're just not getting it or whatever. But be positive. Praise when warranted. Thank them for contacting you and taking your words and making them reasonable. Oftentimes, more of late, I'm asked for written responses, and that can be really great because you can avoid some misquotes, but I've also seen my written responses hacked, with each response hacked in half so that they didn't make a lot of sense when you ended up reading them. But I do find written responses particularly useful when time permits. Use your website or websites as a toolbox so you can quickly grab information. It's amazing what I can get my hands on today quickly for an interview that would have been impossible to do 15 or 20 years ago. Don't bother saying off the record. Just assume you're on the record all the time. Know the medium and frame your responses accordingly. When I'm talking to television or radio, I know the sound bites that are needed. When I'm talking to a newspaper, sometimes I have to look at the clock to make sure we stop talking in a reasonable amount of time. And just as the first question Aaron asked, one of the choices was, try to enjoy yourself. If this is something you don't like to do, don't do it, or don't do it so often. But if you think you're enjoying it and you're making a difference, then by all means, I highly encourage you to do so. And, you know, I'll finish up with just some tongue-in-cheek type of things. I actually did give an interview on how to build a snowman, and it may sound trite, but I was able to talk about all the different properties of snow. Now, maybe my advice resulted in the snowman on the left, and if they'd gone to a real snow sculptor, they might have gotten something better. But even there, that was a fun one, and you have to have fun doing this, or, as I said, probably just not worth it. So with that, I thank you. You saw my picture before, taken last Thursday, standing almost right where this shot is being taken now, out in a park along the Delaware-Raritan Canal in central New Jersey. And with that, I thank you very much and look forward to answering your questions later and turn it over to Jeff.
Great. I hope everybody can hear me. This is let me just. There we go. Before I get started, a couple of things. Aaron and the UCS folks might not remember this, but I was always proud of the fact that at the height of, I ran the public affairs department in both the Bush at the National Science Foundation in both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. But at the height of the anti-science wars in the second term for President Bush, UCS graded all the public affairs departments at the agencies, and ours was the only one to get an A from UCS because we went out of our way, and to this day NSF still does this, to encourage scientists to speak directly with the media without filters. And what's more, we even launched a program. Chris Mooney ran a program and trained hundreds of NSF-funded scientists for our office over the years. Chris now is a leading blogger at the Washington Post and carries that regard for scientists with him to his coverage of the Washington Post. I will say that most reporters, by and large, really consider scientists maybe the most trusted source they're going to ever use in a story. So you should just know that going in. So people remember stories. It's how we learn. So as you're explaining things to the media or when you're writing, it really and truly does help to have a story attached to to what you're trying to talk about, because most people, and this includes reporters as well, will attach a story to what you're trying to talk about. And the truth is that storytelling can actually lead to significant change. This is a screenshot of my old boss, Dr. Kessler, Most people in Washington know that when I was David's head of public affairs, I talked him into regulating the tobacco industry. And David took a very simple story, which is that nicotine is addictive and that cigarettes are engineered to addict kids, and told that story over and over and over to explain why the FDA was regulating the tobacco industry, and used that simple story to make a very powerful point. I was also quite good friends and worked with Dr. Koop for years. Dr. Koop mastered the art of storytelling. It wasn't just his courageous actions, but it was his ability to tell a simple story to illustrate a very powerful point. He did that with condom prevention for HIV, even in the Reagan administration. He later did that with his second Surgeon General's report on tobacco smoking and dangers. But Dr. Koop was a pretty masterful storyteller. Malcolm Gladwell has also been a longtime friend. His book, The Tipping Point, actually emerged after he spent his formative years as a Washington Post reporter basically working with largely social scientists and others, but learned early on that powerful stories can change national conversations and dialogues. And much of his work relates to that. For those who don't know, I was also, and for those who don't recognize this picture, that's also one of my old bosses. I was Dan Quayle's communications director at the White House. For those who don't remember, before there was Sarah Palin, there was Dan Quayle. This is where he was. He's holding a cue card. A teacher had handed him with potato misspelled with an E at the end, and the kid at the blackboard got it correct. Dan Quayle got it wrong, and it was captured on CNN. And was the end of his career. And the reason it ended his career was because that one simple story illustrated what had been in the media for quite a few years. One of the things I did at NSF for a long time, and I know all of you are familiar with broader impacts, but we had to defend the use of broader impacts as one of the two criteria for a very long time, not at NSF with the National Science Board. When most people look at broader impacts, we always had to encourage the scientific community to please, at least every so often, try to handle outreach. Most people settle on educational materials or partnerships or sometimes infrastructure. Very few want to wade into outreach as for their broader impacts submission. I will tell you this, I've said in dozens or in hundreds of review panel sessions, when scientists come up with well thought out, well structured ways to do outreach around their research proposals, it really gets people's attention. So I would encourage everybody to think that way. The other thing that, while you as scientists may know this, that most of the submissions, the highly cited submissions and the highly cited sources in papers are from Science, Nature, and PNAS. It's also true for the media. You may not know this, but 90 to 95% of the media coverage around science-based stuff comes from the big three. It just is the way it is. All three have pretty sophisticated operations for getting embargoed materials into the hands of reporters. So it's just something that all of us in the science, media, and communications world understand, is that a lot of it is driven by those three. So it's not just the submissions and the citations. It's also a recognition that the media covers those three areas. I also wanted to mention a little bit about science PIOs. The world has changed in journalism, so much so that there's a considerable blurring between blogging and posting and content and media articles, so much so that a site like Futurity News or The Conversation now gets wide readership right alongside, say, a Guardian science article. And what's more, in places like The Guardian, to readers, blogs sometimes tend to be indistinguishable between to readers from the news pieces. The folks who understand this world are the public information officers, and the very best ones really know how to do this and to navigate this new emerging media landscape. One of the things I did at NSF when I was there was we developed a strong PIO network, and by the time I left there to start Climate Nexus, the PIO network was up to several hundred and was the backbone of the National Science Writers Association. So I would encourage all of you to work with your PIOs. David talked a little bit about sound bites. I want to say that through long practice with media and in terms of training folks, you actually don't really want to practice a sound bite. Sound bites emerge around your own core messages, what you want to do. What you need to want to settle on is what you want people to remember, what you want the media to take away, and simplify that down to 3 core messages. It really does work, and it's actually a pretty straightforward process. Just settle on what you want to talk about, and then simplify it down to your 3 core messages. That's true for media interviews, and you can generally stick to that if you want to. You can expand on that as you write your own materials, but simple messages by trusted sources repeated often it really is true. The media recognizes it's sort of the standard for communications. Very quickly, in the climate story, one of the reasons I left NSF was I was frustrated that the climate story and the climate narrative was pretty badly mangled back in 2009, so it's one of the reasons we started Climate Nexus. These 4 messages you see here are the things we've been working on hard for the last 3 years to change the national conversation around climate. That it's about people, not polar bears. That things had by and large gotten a bit sideways. Thankfully now, several years later, it's no longer the case. The other thing we needed to do was to change the perception that it wasn't a future threat, that in fact it's a present threat, and that something was happening to our planet. And finally, this is sometimes harder to do, but when the media actually expects you to talk about both the threat and solutions at the same time, and it's especially true for an issue like climate change. We did this in a couple of ways. The first way is we developed, and you can find this on our website for those who care and follow the climate issue. We have 2 deep messaging guides. The first is called Connecting the Dots, and we held no less than 30 national media briefings with dozens of scientists over the last 18 months to 2 years that connects the dots between extreme weather events and both current and emerging climate science. And then we also followed that up with another large earned media campaign that drives climate change impacts down to the community level. And both of those were very helpful in framing the discussion for the media around the issue. And then this last slide shows you as an example of how this worked. We worked with an organization called Climate Central and their scientists there to bring the concept of sea level rise down to the local level, and it drove both national coverage. All 4 of the major networks had pieces, about it, as well as all the major newspapers. But it also drove down to the local level, which is pretty important. Even when you're an expert in your own field, looking for the relevance to connected fields will often help the media understand what you're trying to do. So there you go. And I'm not sure what happens now. I think we turn it over to Aaron and questions.
Yeah, thank you both so much. It's really great to get both your perspectives, and we've had a ton of questions come in from our members. We've also had a bunch of questions that people sent in ahead of time, so I think we should just hop right into it. And for the folks who are listening right now, please do keep sending in your questions. We're getting a lot, so I anticipate that we won't be able to answer them all on the webinar today. But please keep typing them in, and we will follow up with you offline to answer any questions that you send in. So first, to start off, we got a lot of questions from a bunch of different participants on the webinar about what do you do when you're misquoted, when you're misrepresented, or when a headline, a story that you were quoted in, if the headline is a little misleading. That's increasingly common now. What does that process look like? How do you talk to the reporter about that, and how do you reach out to them to work for that correction or for that change? And I would ask both of you to please respond to that.
Dave, why don't you go first?
Yeah, this is Dave. I'm comfortable enough that I will contact the reporter. I've never gone around a reporter and gone to an editor. I sometimes know the answer I'm going to get is that I lost control of the article. Even though my byline is on it, they just pulled things from it and put my byline on it, or I don't write the headlines. But I've gotten feedback because I think I've gained their respect, and they will come back to me. And sometimes nowadays they'll correct something if it's on their website. Other times they've passed things along, and I've gotten an apology from another reporter who said, I'm sorry I didn't list any attribution. You have to let those things roll off your back a little bit. As I said earlier, fool me once, shame on you. But, if they do it more often, shame on me for continuing to talk with them. So, I'm not the type of person that yells and screams, but I'm not the type of person that's going to ignore it. But then again, I must say, with the state climate work and all, 90% of the interviews I give, I never see the outcome. I just don't go looking for them. I don't go listening to them. I really just don't have the time.
So this is Jeff. That's a great question. I have lots of friends who are national journalists, and I have a hard and fast rule. I don't ever yell at reporters, and I would encourage everybody to basically adopt that rule. Here's the reason why. Reporters are like us. They're people. They don't like to be yelled at. Nobody likes to be yelled at. And reporters also tend not to get feedback from their readers. So if the only feedback they're getting is negative, it's never a good thing. When a reporter's gotten something wrong, it's not that I don't reach out to them or others don't reach out to them, but you reach out and with either a question or, would you consider, you give them a way out, and it's always a constructive question. It's especially true now in the digital age. If you look at the New York Times, for instance, they just changed. They went away from their page one discussion. Their focus is on digital. Every reporter now has the ability to change something that's posted online. But the way into that discussion is to pose the question based on expert resources or expert commentary. Did you know that there's a better answer to this, or that but potentially you could have phrased this differently? Quite often a reporter, if you approach it constructively, they will change it. And I will also say never, ever, ever go over their heads, ever, unless you want to create an enemy for life. So those are my two hard and fast rules in dealing with mistakes in the media.
I would say that those echo a lot of my experiences at UCS too, and I think in particular for someone who works in communications like me, I never want to be in the position of demanding something from a reporter. It's really about helping the reporter do their job. And one thing that's always stood out to me, with the reporters I've worked with, all of them almost universally are very responsible with their jobs. They're actually similar to scientists in one really important respect, which is that accuracy is just king. And if you come to a reporter and say, I'm worried that the way you put this is inaccurate, or I don't think that this quote was accurate, 99 times out of 100, they are going to be responsive to that. There have been times where I've had colleagues or independent scientists approach me and they've said, well, I don't like this story. And I said, okay, well, is the story inaccurate? No, but I don't like it. And there's a distinction there. You might not like a story, but if the actual stuff written down on the paper, on the page, on the web, et cetera, it's kind of a narrower question about whether or not a reporter will see something as accurate or inaccurate. But I would just echo what Dave and Jeff said too. I think it's delicate, and if you have the facts on your side, it's really easy to win and to get that correction. Jay Kimball asked us another question. I'd love your responses to. He said, what do you do when you're paired or invited to be paired with somebody who rejects the science on whatever topic you're working on? So we know this comes up in climate. I've also heard this from evolutionary biologists. This happens with epidemiologists who work on vaccines. What can you do to avoid or deal with those kind of misleading debate situations on contentious topics?
Yeah, this is Dave. I'll avoid them. I'll be perfectly honest. I will not sit on a panel where I know they're going after that provocation. It's imbalanced, and the fact is, the minute you walk into the room, you as a scientist have lost the argument because you are a natural skeptic as a scientist. The minute you say the word uncertainty or additional work is needed, they'll jump right down your throat. Okay, so that's one thing. Quite honestly, I will avoid that. I think it's a lose-lose situation. However, I've given many a talk where there has been a skeptic or denier, whatever your choice of words is. I'd say denier because they have all the mantras down. And they usually wait until the end of the questioning period after my talk, and then they'll fire off 3 or 4 questions because their goal is to leave the audience with some level of uncertainty for what I've just been talking about. And so what I do there is I take them point by point and start explaining things. Do not show frustration. Do not avoid answering these questions, and try to be as straightforward as possible. So that's kind of my approach.
This is Jeff. I will, and Aaron connected this as well because I know he gives the same advice. We tend to try to steer scientists away from engaging in television interviews with deniers. You can never win in those environments, but every so often it will happen. And I will just tell you very quickly. One of my latest books was called Oil. It was a novel about oil in the Middle East having nothing to do with the climate change debate in this country. But my publicist was a former press secretary for the Republican National Committee, and she stuck me on 24 conservative national talk shows. And I got paired quite often with Senator Inhofe, who had a book out called The Global Warming Hoax. It was a Donnybrook over and over on these calls. And what I will say is in the middle of those, I adopted I have a way of dealing with things like that called the relentless positive storm. You don't respond to deniers. You stick to what you want to talk about, and from a very positive standpoint, stick to what you know, and don't engage with the deniers. But it's tough. Honestly, it's tough. It's one of the reasons why we don't encourage scientists to go into interviews with deniers, because the uncertainty and debate is the denier's friend, and it's not the scientist's friend in those forums.
That's great, guys. And I would add 2 other quick thoughts there. I think there's a distinction between being invited to have a misleading debate about the science, which I agree. I don't recommend that scientists do that, and being invited to talk with a host one-on-one, a host of a radio show or a television show who might be skeptical or might even reject mainstream science on a given topic. And if you're really well prepared for it and you're a really good communicator, I might recommend that, okay, you can go talk to that host one-on-one, because the audience that host has, they tend to trust what the host has to say. They look at them as an opinion leader, and if you think you can actually have a somewhat productive on-air conversation with that host, and they're not going to go after you or your reputation or lambast scientists broadly, those can be difficult conversations, but I also feel like they can be productive ones that can help move the needle a little bit. The other thing that I try to do, with so many of these invitations to debate, they're really proxy debates. The debate isn't about the science or the validity of the science. It's really a debate about policy, and the science is being used as a proxy. And that's true on climate. It's true across a lot of issues. So one thing that I try to do and that I recommend scientists do is when you get a debate invitation like that, have recommendations for people who do respect the science and get the science accurate, but who disagree with each other about the policy. And I've had limited success with this. It's tough, but when it's happened, it's been good, because the real debates very often in these fields that we work in, they are about the policy. So you should have policymakers, advocacy groups, folks like that arguing with each other about them in public, but they should all have the shared baseline of what the basic science is. So I think it's another way to approach it. But yeah, I think you'll hear this recommendation to not engage in misleading debates pretty universally from science communicators at this point. I think we've all learned a lot of lessons from the evolution wars, the climate wars, you name it. So I have another question here from Sarah N. Kind of interesting. What are some other methods of reaching the public, either through the media besides direct interviews and articles, especially at the local level? And I would ask, are there other things scientists should be thinking about, outside of media interviews, maybe things like public lectures, stuff like that? What are some general pieces of advice that you have, or some other thoughts or some other venues that scientists can think about for public education?
Well,
Dave,
I'll jump in. I do give several dozen public lectures a year to any level of group, school children to senior citizen groups to environmental municipality and their environmental groups, so on and so on and so forth. A lot of watershed associations and such. So that's a very useful way. Sometimes you can be accused of preaching to the choir, but not always at all. I've talked to some corporate groups as well, not as often. And frankly, one of the highest compliments I received was when someone came up to me afterward and said, well, I don't agree with everything you're saying about climate change and such, but thank you for respecting me as someone who's intelligent and not just feeding me some party jargon. So, you never know what's going to come out of it sometimes. So a lot of public presentations, some people are very comfortable blogging. We put short stories sometimes on our Facebook site and on our websites. There are a lot of different ways you can engage the public these days.
So this is Jeff. It's actually a pretty interesting time right now. There are opportunities available to scientists to reach the public that didn't really exist just 10 years ago. One of the other things that I do is I write a weekly science column for U.S. News and World Report called At the Edge. The last 3 weeks, I've written columns on some new research on stuttering. The post today was on time travel. It's not real time travel. It's based on some new neuroscience research that talks about highly visual memories and where they come from, and another piece about some data that show that solar jobs are the fastest growing energy jobs in the United States. All three of those are a hybrid blog or column, but they're based on scientific research. There are sites like Futurity News or The Conversation that allow scientists to write directly to the public. The Conversation, which started in Australia from the executive editor of The Age, has exploded in popularity in Australia and has now spread to the United States and Europe. Similarly, Futurity News actually has a public readership. There are other sites like that. I wouldn't encourage folks to just blog because it's hard to get an audience behind blogs, but you can attach your writing and your science and inside of other blogs. There are big science blogging networks with Discover Magazine and Scientific American and others. But it starts with writing a piece clearly and directly without jargon, and then using it for other means, and potentially even with answering questions in a podcast that you can literally do with someone else, a public information officer, and make it available. So there are opportunities to reach the public now, but it starts with presenting what you want to say in text first, making sure it makes sense, and then finding other ways to export that to the broader world. It's actually a pretty exciting time right now to communicate directly with the public.
We have another question from Stacy M. in Minnesota, and she notes that it's frustrating to be taken out of context, and she asks, is it appropriate as an interviewee to ask a journalist to see a piece before it's published? And I'd be curious to hear from both of you on this too. Do you ever ask journalists to do that, or do journalists ever ask you if it's okay to run something by you before they publish it?
I invite them to pass it by me. That's more the case when it's a longer-term piece. I think I say it in a way in which I encourage them to do so. But I can't recall last time I said I'd really like to see this before it's published, because I just don't think that's going to get you in the right frame with a particular reporter. So
this is Jeff. I will say it's actually a no. It's actually a no to ask a reporter or any reporter, to discuss what they're going to write ahead of time. That being said, a lot of reporters will do that. In fact, I have a whole slew of reporters who will practically read their entire story to me beforehand just to make sure. Because again, as Aaron mentioned at the top, they do not want to get anything wrong in their pieces. That getting material facts wrong is death to a journalist. So but what is perfectly acceptable is to talk to a reporter about what you're telling them, what the context is, and what they're going to, which quotes they're going to use. That's perfectly acceptable. And then if you get into a dialogue with a reporter over something where you feel like it's, it's acceptable, a lot of reporters will in fact share what they're working on, just to make sure they get it right. But asking ahead of time, please tell me what you're doing, you shouldn't do that, because it's really not something that the media expects.
We had another question from a member. They say that they generally decline any request for comment that's outside the immediate subject areas that their published research touches upon. And I hear this question a lot from other scientists. How do you draw some lines between what you feel like you have the expertise to talk about publicly versus what, say, another colleague might have kind of jurisdiction over that research area? How do you handle some of those questions that are maybe just a few steps removed from your core research area?
Jeff, you want to go first?
Sure. I will say that's a phenomenal question, and it's the biggest challenge for both the media and the scientists. I will tell you, in the climate change area, for instance, it's one of the biggest problems we have. There aren't very many climate scientists who can speak broadly to everything, who understand ocean acidification, who understand atmospheric science, who understand climate attribution, who understand ice melt, subglacial ice melt, I could go on and on and on. And so they don't feel comfortable talking outside of their area of expertise. And it's one of the reasons why we have so few people who can speak broadly, and the media desperately, desperately wants people who speak broadly to all these questions. There's a trick for doing this. I would encourage everybody to not be afraid to speak outside of their area of expertise, but always caveat it and be transparent. When you answer something outside of your area, just be honest with the board. Say, look, I'm not an expert. That's not my area of expertise, but I talk to colleagues a lot. I have some thoughts on this. And your guesses are pretty good educational guesses. I would encourage you to reach outside of your area of expertise, and you'll get better at it. Because the truth is, the media needs broader experts. They recognize your core competency, but they'd actually like you to comment beyond your expertise. But as you do so, be transparent about it. It's not your core area. But I would encourage you to go ahead and try anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Again, it's also knowing the depth of which they're trying to reach. If it's a quick article where an earthquake might have occurred, and they call them state climatologists, well, I happen to be trained as a geologist, and I've had geophysics, so I feel comfortable. But when it gets to a certain point, I think most academics, and I'll often say, if I don't know the answer, I usually know somewhere or someone to go to get to the answer. So I very often agree with what Jeff said, and then I'll add, and if you want more, I would call this person or that person or contact someone at that agency or university. So I'll often try to say, I'm not the expert, here's the basics, if you want more, here's my suggestion.
We had another question that is pretty core and pretty fascinating to me, and the basic of the question is, how do you become a go-to expert in your field in the first place? And maybe to translate that a little bit, I'm wondering if, Dave, you can talk a little bit about how the communications part of your career has evolved over time, and maybe, Jeff, there's some scientists you can think of who you've seen grow as communicators over time, and maybe there's some good lessons to draw out of that for how you can build these skills and how they kind of build on themselves to the point where, as Dave put it, you're that first name in the Rolodex when reporters have a story about your field.
Yeah, well, I'm never shy about talking. I'm a professor, after all. As I said earlier, I've had very few press releases, but over time, in the 90s, I guess I became recognized. I picked up the phone too often. I did keep logs of who I spoke to because I always thought it would help convince the deans to give more support for the state climate office. I'm still trying, and I've had some wonderful support at Rutgers, but could always use more. So it just evolved with time. And I've been, the reporters are smart. They'll compliment you, and they'll get on the phone and say, I was recommended to talk to you. I hear you're a good interview. So then you start honing those skills. And as I said, and as Jeff said, you have to enjoy this. If you don't enjoy doing that, if you don't enjoy being ready to answer who knows what question might come along, then by all means, step back. And one of your colleagues might be able to do it. But I absolutely encourage anyone listening to this to give it a shot. Take some time. Jeff had some great pointers on coming up with sticking to your points and sticking with your story and telling a good story. And then you'll enjoy it. But I guess it just kind of evolved with time, and then reporters talk to reporters, and you develop a reputation, hopefully a positive one.
So, and this is Jeff. The couple of things for establishing a reputation, if it's something you want to do with the media. First is there are, in your fields, there are groups like UCS, Union of Concerned Scientists, or in the climate field, Climate Nexus, and others who work so close with the media. We spend a lot of time advising the media who they should talk to. So when we've probably done hundreds of media briefings, background media briefings in the last 4 years, we generally present 3 or 4 experts to the media to talk to. So working with organizations and groups that have a relationship with the media is quite honestly, it's pretty smart to do. The second thing is to look for pivotal types of articles that establish your reputation. If you've got a piece of research that's in one of the big 3, PNAS, Science or Nature, and you have a chance to see it crack the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Associated Press, take advantage of it, because that will begin to establish your reputation. I will also tell you a very quick story, and Dr. Kessler hates when I tell this story, but even the smartest people in the world need a bit of help when they get started. When David Kessler came in as the FDA commissioner, David is one of the smartest people I know on the planet. He somehow talked Harvard Medical School and the University of Chicago Law School into letting him go to both places concurrently. He got his JD and his MD at the same time in 2 different cities. He was as prepared as you can be coming into FDA, but he had never dealt with the media. And he didn't want to learn how to do that or to condense his points down to 3 core messages and defend them. So to teach him a lesson, I put him in front of a remote live national television interview for his very first interaction with the media. And sure enough, live on Good Morning America, he froze. And he learned, coming out of that, he learned to be prepared before he went into, no matter who it was, just simply to be prepared, know what you want to say, and stick to it. And is now, a pretty phenomenal expert with the media. So that's basically my answer. One, be prepared, even with small interviews, because that teaches you how to get prepared for the bigger ones.
I'd add one other quick thought in there, and I've heard from a lot of scientists who do this. A lead scientist or a lead researcher, somebody who's leading a lab, they might handle the bulk of the interview requests that come in, and then they'll farm out some of the interview requests, to their colleagues, to the folks that they're supervising, and really thinking about media and communications as a career development thing for some of the folks in their lab. And that has 2 advantages. One is, it helps that person grow their reputation. It helps them get better at dealing with the media. But I think for a senior scientist or for a lead researcher, it also helps them to save some time, especially if they're getting an interview request from a journalist who really needs more time catching up to speed on the basics. It can be really effective to say, you know what, why don't you talk to one of my colleagues and they can walk you through some of this. I think there's an opportunity for scientists to share some of those requests that are coming in to help their colleagues develop too. And I know some folks who worked on fuel economy for years, and my old colleague David Friedman, who works for the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration now, he's a fuel economy expert, and I watched him really grow as a communicator and becoming that front of the Rolodex person. And that started with other people who work on fuel economy getting requests from media outlets, so that the reporter needed really basic information. What is fuel economy? How does the Department of Transportation set it? How do you measure it? What does this really mean? And he would say, well, why don't you talk to David and he'll explain it to you and then come back to me for a nice quote. David was happy to do that because it gave him so much of an opportunity to talk to these reporters, to learn how reporters ask questions. It really gave him a great baseline to grow from. So I think it's totally fair for scientists and experts to do that sort of thing too. We are getting close to the end of the hour here, so Dave and Jeff, I wanted to invite you to share any closing thoughts that you had for folks in the webinar, or anything else you wanted to just plug briefly that folks should look out for.
It's funny, I won't say look out for it, but I think you should be prepared for it. And it happened to me in the last 48 hours when I was contacted by a magazine to comment on kind of what snow meant within the climate system and so on and so forth, and said, the reporter said, I'm on a tight deadline, so I'd appreciate any assistance you can provide. Please get back to me at your earliest convenience. I responded 26 hours later, from 5 p.m. on Tuesday till 9 p.m. last night, and I hear back from the reporter this morning that they've already written the article. Shame on me. It was a magazine. Well, it turns out it's going on the web part of their magazine. And the fact is, I spent a half an hour writing what I thought were pretty thoughtful answers last night, totally for naught. So there are going to be times when you're going to talk, you're going to write, and you're going to be left hanging on the cutting room floor or whatever, and you just have to let it go and move on. So it's something we didn't talk about. We talked about being misquoted. In this case, we talked about not getting into the mix because I should have asked, what do you mean by a sharp deadline?
This is Jeff. I will say that sadly, science media coverage has cratered over the last 10 years. There are a lot fewer science reporters as the media has changed and contracted. Science reporters as well as environmental reporters, sort of specially niche, they're considered in the media to be specially and niche reporters, even though science coverage and environmental coverage tends to be things that the public really likes, but advertisers don't generally support them as much, so they're some of the first things cut. You should just recognize that science media has changed, and reporters now who used to have the luxury of only having to deal with one story, maybe dealing with 10 stories compared to what they used to write about. Reporters like Seth Bornstein at the Associated Press literally gets 500 press releases a day. So the fact that don't wait for people to call you, the fact that it's difficult to reach out to the media shouldn't deter you, because it's just science coverage is much harder to generate now. So just recognize the way things have changed, but also recognize the opportunities. I'll tell you a very quick story. Even at the National Science Foundation, we had a press conference. We had a Harvard astronomer who had a brand new, awesome piece of research that showed that they had a Goldilocks planet in their sights for the first time. It was actually pretty big news. Nobody showed up for the press conference, despite the fact that we promoted it because there was a lot of other stuff going on. But we captured it. We made it available through lots of other media channels, and eventually it made its way into the news. So you want to be a bit relentless in talking about your research or what you want to talk about, and just recognize that the science media landscape has changed dramatically in the last 10 years.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you everybody for joining us. Our next Science Communications webinar is going to be on Thursday, March 26th at 3 p.m. It's going to touch on pushing back against misinformation. So please check that out. SciNet workshops after the ucsusa.org. That's where you can find our upcoming workshops. You can find recordings of our previous workshops. And Jeff and Dave, really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for sharing your expertise and for sharing your stories. And thank you all for joining and listening today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.